And hello, everybody on YouTube, if you're out there, if anybody's watching.
Hello, everybody. Well, we're waiting for the
hordes,
the excited masses, the uprising masses, to or the Celtic hordes, depending which way you look at it, to start battering on Hadrian's Wall. This is the Foreign Press Association in New York, and I am Ian Williams, the president. And we have with us today Mark Blyth, who is, I think you're a US citizen now as well, like me, an expatriated Scot, who maintains connections and watches closely what is happening across the Atlantic. And his main expertise is in economics. So his very, very good book, which I interviewed him some years ago, was on austerity, which he pointed out was an extremely bad idea, and eloquently and demonstratively showed it was a very, very bad idea.
And his
latest book, which I happened to miss because I think I was dying in hospital at the time, was Angrynomics. I have to catch up on it and get back to it, about the effect of what austerity does to people's sanity.
In part, yeah, absolutely.
So with the moving to Scotland, he's followed closely the British and the Scottish economies and looks at the independence battle as a sort of pragmatic thing. But it's not just about Scotland, because I think one of the reasons why Foreign Press Association wanted to highlight this issue was it's got implications in lots of ways that people don't quite consider.
Oh, yeah.
It's got implications for small countries. Remember, this is the dissolution of a union that's lasted in one form or another since 400 years if you take it back to 1600, the Union of the Crowns. 300 years if you had the Union of the Parliaments. This is far more significant than Texas or Missouri or Kansas seceding from the Union in that sense. It's an historic nation that's being dismembered, an historic state that's being dismembered, possibly. And it's also got implications, therefore it's got implications for Catalonia, it has implications for Alsace-Lorraine, it has implications for Brittany, lots of places. So lots of people in Europe are going to look very anxiously, which of course is what complicates matters for the Scots who want independence, because the Spanish and many others have shown, as in the case of Kosovo, that they don't like secession as a general principle.
Yeah.
They don't look at the particular cases, they don't look at particular examples, they look at the precedent it sets for their fractious regions. So we have that. We also have the fact that Britain's seat at the top table in the UN, for example, depends to some extent. It's not an explicit one-on-one, but it's possession of one of the 5 states possessing nuclear weapons. And it so happens that England does not possess those weapons. They're in Scotland, which the Scots alternatively whinge about because they're the number 1 target, and 2, they gloat about because it brings a lot of money into the economy from America and from London. So there are lots of implications here about the international alliances. Is Britain worth as much to NATO without the nuclear bases in Scotland and the sort of stranglehold on the North Atlantic Passage for submarines? And of course, there's the whole issue, is it good for the Scots? Mm-hmm. Speaking as someone from Liverpool, I do hope the Scots don't, because it leaves us in the north of England on our own, facing the Norman yoke out of the home counties. But that's a sort of minor and separate issue. So Mark, explain the economics. Can Scotland go it alone?
So there's so much stuff to cover. You've named all the important stuff, and I do hope we get a chance to talk about all of it, because it's all important, the nukes, everything, right? But let's start with a simple way of thinking about this. Now, much of Scotland's current resurgent interest in being independent comes from the fact that it was voted down in 2014, didn't get through the referendum, but then there was Brexit. And Brexit was this thing, it's like, we voted to remain, England voted to go, now we've been dragged out. This is going to cause harm to the economy. blah, blah, blah. So we need to be on our own. Now, there's pretty good arguments for being on your own, and I'll get onto those in a minute, make that the second thing, but let's just think about the problem this way. It's two pretty average sized cities. One of them is and could be a bigger financial hub. The other one is a commercial/industrial hub. It's got an oil town, which, like oil, all oil towns is going to decline, namely Aberdeen. And it's got a kind of biotech video game hub, kind of, with Dundee. Then there's a whole bunch of small towns that kind of live off tourism and agriculture and things like that. There's lots of space. It could generate lots of renewables. It's in a strategically important location. And there's only 4.5 million people. More people live in Brooklyn, New York than live in Scotland. So how hard could it be, right? That's number one. Here's number two. If your argument that we need to do this is because of Brexit, then Scotland separating from England is the biggest Brexit in history. Because the last time Scotland was fully economically independent, the word capitalism hadn't been uttered. It's been together for over 300 years. So if pulling apart 30 years of economic integration with Europe is going to hurt, 300 is going to hurt a lot. Now that means one of two things. Either you have brass plate independence, by which I mean you declare independence, you get a vote, but nothing really changes. You put some brass plates in Edinburgh and nothing's really changed. You have the pound, all this sort of stuff. Or you have actual regulatory divergence, a different currency, a different economic policy, etc., which will entail significant short to medium term costs. There is no way around that. And we know that because it's Brexit times 10. Now, those two things are simultaneously true. If you're an optimist, you start with the how hard could it be? I mean, it's only 4 million people and we've got loads of resources. If you're a pessimist, you go 300 years of deep economic integration, good luck unwinding that. Both of these things are simultaneously true, and both of them have to be taken into account in any serious discussion of the economics of independence.
And you mentioned about it always perplexed me when the Scots nationalists were pressing for independence, but wanted to keep the pound. And I couldn't see what was the point of independence if your economy was going to be completely dependent on the whims of the Bank of England and the British Treasury.
Right, but again, that's a kind of one-sided understanding of this, right? Particularly because it's inflected with a lot of modern monetary theory ideas about if you've got a currency, everything else kind of works itself out, which is not really true. So let's think about this in a slightly different way. 60%, Scotland's imports to GDP is about 70%, which means it's a small open economy. 60% of those exports go to England, the thing that you're about to separate from. So one of the major growth drivers for your economy currently has 100% regulatory alignment, free trade. You're about to put barriers in between that for 60% of your exports. That's going to hurt. Second thing, you can have your own currency, but if you're a small open economy, it doesn't really matter. Because at the end of the day, you end up pegging to your biggest markets. So the Danes peg to the euro, even though that they have their own currency. The Swedes peg to the euro, even though they have their own currency. The Hungarians, the Romanians, they all peg to the euro because that's what they trade into, right? So 60% of our exports still go to Britain. Until we change that, until that becomes a different configuration of exports, we're going to peg to the pound. So you can have your own currency, you're still going to run a peg to the pound, right? So this is the stuff that needs to be thought through. It's not just a question of if you have your own currency, then you will be fine. Right? If you're a small open economy, you have what's called the current account constraint, right? You need to export in order to pay for your imports because you'll never be self-sufficient in the stuff that you need. To do that, you need to have a credible exchange rate policy so that people don't go, that's just funny money, I'm not touching it. And if a whole bunch of your exports go to one place, you end up basically trying to shadow the exchange rate of your major trading partner. So what's your autonomy? Not much, right? These are the structural facts that people need to deal with.
We had a bit of a dress rehearsals for that with the independence of Southern Ireland era, the Republic of Ireland, because they were using the British pound until after the euro came, I think, wasn't it? No, they introduced the punt, didn't they?
Yeah, it was the pound and the punt, and then, but basically all the way through the punt period, what they were doing is they were basically shadowing the British pound. So it's more of a nominal than a kind of real independent monetary policy. I mean, the thing is, Ian, if you look at this globally, right, independent monetary policy is a bit of a joke that died sometime around 2010. everybody follows the Fed. If the Fed puts rates up, everybody puts rates up. If the Fed cuts rates, everybody cuts rates, right? I mean, it's a bit of a canard anyway.
So is this an argument for or against independence? Or
no. Here's how I think about it with all those constraints, right? I think there's three things that have to be accepted. The first one is, and I put myself in the nationalist camp, not because I'm a nationalist emotionally, but simply by default. I'd call it a kind of pragmatic nationalism. Gordon Brown did a piece in the Daily Mail the other day where he framed it as 30% unionist, 30% nationalist, 40% they can be persuaded, right? I'm one of the 40% that's kind of edged into the nationalist camp for three main reasons. The first one is I don't think the British economic model is sustainable over the long term. It is essentially a giant financial hub that generates about 12% of GDP in London. 22% of British GDP actually is generated in London as a whole. The rest of the country is GVA negative, gross value added negative, which means it's not growing. QED, everybody lives off transfers. Second thing is when Boris and his crew, who are going to be in power forever, given the state of the Labour Party, talk about levelling up the country, that is an imaginary that runs in a line from Liverpool to Sheffield. Right? There's nothing above that. Scotland is already not part of that imaginary. There's a de facto independence in this way. And the third one is the demographic one, which is that, people themselves, particularly younger people in Scotland, overwhelmingly think this is a good idea. Now, we can get into why it's the young versus the old, which has to do with assets and pensions and all those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, the demographic, the democratic misfit, if you will, between permanently being governed by English Tories and consistently voting for anything but that and never having your own government, right? I think all of those pressures basically push you towards this has to be better, but it pushes you in a nationalist direction. The problem is to get there, you need to basically square these two things. How do you unravel 300 years of independence without killing yourself and get to a better place? But you do have the advantage that it's really just two cities that live pretty close together and a handful of other things. So how difficult can it be? And the answer is not get your own currency and everything will be fine, right? You need to think about what is the underlying business model? What does Scotland actually do in terms of exports? Because it's going to have to live by its exports. If carbon is on the way out, you can forget North Sea oil. So what's the next trick, right? That's the stuff that we need to think about over the next 5 to 10 years and make a convincing case that we can get from here to there.
Well, we can do the Life of Brian gig. What's Westminster ever done for us?
And fair point. I mean, any unionist will tell you that Scotland does get higher per capita GDP spending because of the Barnett formula and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like the whole country's living on the dole, and the dole's paid for by England. If that business model in London runs into trouble, which I think eventually it's going to, then the ability to sustain those transfers is already in question. Why would you want to basically have the next 30 years of living on handouts from London? I just think it's a bad option.
Especially in London, under the political control of people who don't believe in handouts for anybody.
Well, it depends. I mean, they'll do plenty of handouts as long as it keeps them in power.
Yeah, but I haven't noticed an enthusiasm for pouring money into Northern and Scottish unemployment, or even Welsh unemployment. Come to think of it. Well, what about the diplomatic repercussions and the sort of quasi-military repercussions? Is Scotland in or out of NATO, in or out of the European Union?
Yeah, so this is very interesting. So basically the SNP have embraced a kind of knee-jerk unilateralism, right? Get the nukes out, we don't want any of that stuff. And I don't know how that's going to work out in the long term, because if you want basically enough FDI, foreign direct investment, to up your investment in your economy so that you can change your business model so you can be independent, a good place to look is the United States, right? And there's plenty of goodwill and there's plenty of organization, there's plenty of rich Scots embedded in everything from Silicon Valley to the Chicago markets and New York real estate, the whole lot, who'd be perfectly willing to help. And if the first thing you do is to basically say to NATO and to the leader of NATO that we're not going to host any nukes anymore and you can forget it and your submarine access is cut off and you can't dock in our ports or any of that sort of stuff, they're going to make life very difficult. And if you do that also from the European side, you're going to basically bugger up NATO's only nuclear deterrent, as you pointed out. Don't expect them to be too forthcoming on the EU membership. On the other hand, if you basically think about this as an asset, which you also alluded to, one way to do this is to basically lease the bases. So you would do a joint lease to the United Kingdom and the United States for Coalport, Holyloch, whatever it is. You declare it ex ante sovereign territory, you sign a 50-year lease, and you get $2 billion a year.
Like the Crimean naval bases, what could go wrong with a model like that?
Well, here's the thing, think about it. This is when the US was doing its war on everything in the early 2000s. They were signing basing agreements with Azerbaijan and all these places, and they were just raking in billions. Now you're doing a transit project. You're trying to get from where you are economically to where you want to be economically. And basically getting a ton of FDI and getting a transfer of $2 billion a year into an economy of only 4.5 million people, that would be a good thing to do. But then you would have to basically swallow all you've said about no nukes and all that sort of stuff. So it depends if the politics wins out. If the politics wins out in the way that it's been written just now, it's going to make the economic transition that much harder.
And well, you don't see a role for others. I wouldn't accept Russian rubles, but what about the Chinese? If they said, you're very much like a naval base in the North Atlantic.
Well, not even the naval base. I mean, basically, if you just went to them into the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Development Bank and said, all right, really, 2 small cities that have already got pretty good communications infrastructure, how about you build the 5G? Well, that's Huawei, so that's a security risk for everybody in the West, right? But you could do that. How about you rebuild our port infrastructure for us and you give us a big loan to do it? To do that was a rounding error on their balance sheet. It's a tiny amount of money. And it gets them right into a strategic position. So you could use the threat of doing that as a way of getting what you want. Alternatively, you could just go to them and say, well, how about we just do this with China because you don't want to play ball? The point is Scotland has options that people don't think about. The question is whether they have, if you will, the wherewithal or desire to follow through on those options.
Well, what would happen, the law of unintended consequences, if we saw what happened with Brexit is that Boris Johnson didn't expect to win the referendum and has been trying to dig himself out the hole he put himself in ever since. Would the Scots Nat Spurgeon have the same problem?
Well, it depends on what you promise going into it. I mean, the problem that I've seen so far is a complete lack of specificity as to here is what the Scottish business model is now. Here is where we want to be. This is how we're going to get from here to here by doing this. Instead of what we've got is Denmark is awesome. We should be like Denmark. If we were independent, we would be Denmark. No, you wouldn't be Denmark. Denmark took 600 years to become Denmark. How do you become your own thing given where you're starting? That's the only thing that really needs to be answered.
Well, the Danes, of course, have quite a connection to Scotland. The Norwegians who came in and threw Macbeth out, and wasn't it?
Yeah, but they've got a far bigger connection to Germany. I mean, you know, they're a peninsula that's stuck up in the hinterland of Germany. There's a great book on the Danish economy from the early 2000s by a guy called Kai Ove Pedersen, called The Cooperative Economy, that Scots would do well to read. That basically says the reason Denmark is rich and cooperative isn't really its social democratic traditions or any of that. It's the fact that you got 80 million Germans up your backside. And if you start fighting amongst yourself, there's nothing left.
Yes, that's Schleswig-Holstein question in times gone by. That was only understood by 2 people and one of them were mad, wasn't it? That was what
something like that, exactly. Yes, the Schleswig-Holstein problem, yes.
So it goes. So how much, we don't want you to do psephology and to make estimates about who in Scotland wants independence? Is there a bourgeoisie that's aiming to get out there and rebuild the Darien project or anything like that?
Well, there are. I mean, there definitely are. Okay, so let's think about it this way. Scotland likes to portray itself as this left-wing alternative to the United Kingdom. You know, if you actually go look at survey data on people's opinions, they're really not any different. If you had independence and you had a party system, 1/3 of them would vote for the local Conservatives, just as they do in Britain. All right, so elections are decided by small margins, not by giant blocks. So the first one is it's not that different from anywhere else, really. Where it differs is in demography. Right, Scotland is an old place. It's not a particularly healthy place, as we know as well, which also doesn't help. But if you think about age and assets, old people have all the money. This is not to say that all rich people are old. They are not, right? There are many poor old people. But if you want to find money, you don't find it with young people. You find assets with old people over the lifetimes they've accumulated. Houses, pensions, yada, 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 right? All that sort of stuff. So if you've got that and you're facing an independence choice, you're thinking to yourself, all right, do I want my pension paid with Bank of England bonds or these new gilt-edged securities? And if you haven't got rocks in your head, you might think to yourself, well, hang on a minute. If they introduce their own currency, it's probably going to trade at a lesser multiple of parity. It's not going to be the same. There's going to be a devaluation, which means that if I've got £1 million of pension assets, I might have £700,000, but nominally a Scottish million. So the question becomes, does that Scottish million in Scotland spend like $1 million, or does it spend like 700,000? And last time around when they did an independent referendum, you saw this in the data. It was the old, qua the people with assets, who kind of made that calculation and went, I like the status quo, thanks very much. As those people slip the mortal coil, what you're finding is more and more young people who are becoming middle-aged are moving into the kind of voting bloc. And the issue here is what statisticians call a cohort effect or a generational effect. So the generational effect is Churchill's maxim, right? So when you're 20, you should be a socialist, and when you're 40, you should be a conservative. Do they all go through their life cycle and do this, right? Is it, in a sense, a generation effect? So the people who are young, who don't have assets now, are going to want to stay with the union once they got assets? Or is it a cohort effect, which is to say that these people are just different and they don't have assets, they're not going to accumulate them, and even if they do, they're going to still want independence? I think the evidence is beginning to suggest that it's a cohort effect more than a generation effect, which means that over time, those people are going to vote for it. But what's still driving this is the fact that if you take a punt on zero, you can't really lose. If you don't have any assets, you might as well vote for the alternative, because it's not as you're going to lose anything, right? So that's the basis of your independence coalition. Now, on top of that, there are definitely sort of, industrial people, financial people, tech people in Scotland who are also in favour of this and think it's a good move. And there are other interested parties as well. But that's basically how I think about it. It's demography plus assets kind of explains the voting preferences.
Well, do you anticipate Scotland getting a rush of returning exiled Scots, making Aliyah to get back to the homeland?
Well, it depends on conditions under what it's under how it's done, but I certainly think that if it did happen, and there were certainly good economic tax incentives to return yourself or your capital, then it would happen. And again, it doesn't have to be that much. I mean, go back to it's 2 cities and 4 million people, right? It doesn't. You're not hanging out there for a couple of $1 trillion, right? A few billion bunged here or there would make a big difference.
Back Andrew Carnegie, all is forgiven.
Well, not necessarily, but certainly Greenfield FDI and the way that Ireland has done it. I mean, there's a misconception that Ireland is all just about the 12.5% corporation tax. I mean, it was, but for the past 10 years since the financial crisis, it's not. It's real FDI, real jobs, real tech sector jobs, etc. In part because they have the access to Europe. But at the same time, Scotland is not exactly devoid of resources, talent, skills, etc., etc. It's a relatively low-cost place to exploit in the economic sense. And it's got great proximity to Europe and also the United Kingdom. So it's not that hard.
In terms of human capital, the Scots used to have a reputation of having an outstanding education system. Has it survived 50 years of austerity from the South?
Well, I mean, I haven't been in it for a long time, but certainly when I was back there in the 1980s, it was an excellent undergraduate education. So much so that when I toured up at Columbia University in the 1990s and found myself sitting next to people from Harvard and Yale, places I'd only ever heard of in movies, far from being in awe, I was astonished that I'd read more than they had. So, which is why I'm able to do what I do today. So no, I don't think it has fallen. I think that the Scottish education system is actually still one of the best in the world, particularly at the undergraduate level.
And this is a big selling point for investment, of course, isn't it?
Well, it's one selling point. I mean, there's lots of other things in here that are sort of misconceptions, right? So what does Scotland export? Oil and whiskey. Let's look at the whiskey sector. It's all owned by foreign companies. It's all owned by global multinationals. how does this affect Scotland? Well, you get taxes and you can do tax revenue, you could possibly push up a little bit on that. It'll take a few bucks extra before people start drinking rye whiskey over Scotch whiskey in mass quantities, particularly in places like Japan where they can afford it, right? So you can do this, but this knocks on in other interesting ways. There's an old friend of mine from Dundee who told me this one. I was shocked by this. You think about Scotland as an agricultural place, and it is. And, you know, I remember growing up picking potatoes, the raspberry fields of Blair Gowrie, all this sort of stuff. But apparently 2/3 of the biomass of Scottish crops is just barley. Just because that's the whiskey industry, right? This is what we grow, which goes into this industry, which is globally unique and competitive. But at the end of the day, we don't actually own that stuff.
So and a bottle of whiskey, you're
going to nationalize the whiskey lines? I mean, you know, how do we think about this? It's not just, I mean, education is part of it. The fact that it buckets down rain all the time is actually kind of an advantage, because it seems that the south of England is drying out. An interesting little factoid: the big champagne houses of France, so from Rheims, have been buying up properties and planting champagne vineyards in Kent. I don't know if you've tried any of the English champagnes in the past couple of years. They're excellent, because it's all getting too hot where they are and it's moving north, right? Well, the thing is, south of England, where it all generates all the gross value added, etc., is also drying out. And Scotland's getting wetter. So why not just build pipelines, take those pipelines for oil and just fill them with water? Shove it down, right? Again, it's only 4 million people. How hard can it be, right? You don't have to support 40 million people, right? Wind, right? The place is windy as hell, right? The technology is known, proven, and cost effective. Batter up hundreds of large-scale windmills and just sell it into the English grid. Why not, right? So there's lots of things that can be done, but it needs to be part of a kind of coherent plan of how to do it.
So, I mean, what form would independence take in sort of politico-economic terms? I mean, how much extra would a Scots government in Edinburgh have to, well, what extra powers would it get that it doesn't have now to do this?
Well, it gets the right to do the most important one in many ways, despite me poo-pooing it a little earlier, which is currency. With currency, you have autonomy because you can then devalue your currency, which is a good shock absorber to have in a crisis. You can kind of play with your own interest rates, although I'm skeptical that a small central bank like Scotland would have effective control of interest rates. You are able to bail your own banks if they have a financial crisis, but the chances are, if you were independent, they'd move to London, because they'd want a better regulator, a better regulator, and also a bigger cushion, which would come with the Bank of England rather than Bank of Scotland. So there's issues there. You'd have control over taxation, raising powers, etc. But most important, you get to choose what you want to spend your stuff on, right? Just now, yes, Scotland gets a lot of money in transfers, but it also contributes through the general taxation to lots of stuff in England that Scotland wouldn't need to do, like having an outsized military, for example, contributing to sort of international public goods on a scale that the United Kingdom does. So there's lots of ways that, like, the upkeep of government buildings all over the United Kingdom. We just wouldn't have to do that. So you could choose. The most important thing is that you would be able to choose. Sorry about that. The most important thing is you'd be able to choose differently what you want to spend that money on, and then also to create a different type of environment in which to get investors and companies to invest their capital and grow.
If anybody's out there has got any questions to bring in, from whichever clan you are, wherever you, Glenn, please send us
there's a couple on here. Let's have a look. Why don't Scots have the right to be governed by politicians elected by the Scots, says Jerry Cassidy. Well, Jerry, because it's a united kingdom. We are all one set of constituencies which send MPs to the Parliament in London, and that has been the case since the Act of Union back in the early 1700s. So we also have a Scottish government, and we can directly elect to the Scottish government. The Scottish government has delegated powers. The way to think about this, it's a bit like the difference between sending senators to DC and having state senators in Albany, right? So think about it that way. Currently, we have a kind of Albany setup. We'd like to have the DC setup.
Michael O'Hurley's question is very relevant. The relationship of the UK with the EU, and whether Scotland will be allowed to rejoin the EU with the political constraints I mentioned about Spanish antipathy to secessionist movements, etc., and whether this could be contingent. I mean, would it be a two-stage question? Do you want independence with or without European Union membership?
No, absolutely. So the EU one is fascinating in multiple levels. So yes, the Spanish don't want Scotland to come in because it suggests Catalonia could do the same and breaks it up, etc. Right? And there's also the stuff about the Security Council, as you correctly highlighted, right? I mean, can you really be one of the big five when you basically lose 10% thereabouts of your GDP? You might even slip out of the G7, right? So, it's not actually that you're no longer a big player. The EU one's complicated by another one, though. The EU is basically a giant exporter bloc run by the Germans. I don't mean this in any snide or short-handed way. I mean, if you basically look at the economic model of the EU since the financial crisis, you've got countries in Eastern Europe which don't join the euro but shadow it closely and basically are the parts suppliers to the German auto and Mittelstand export complex. Then you've got the Danes and Swedes that are part of that as high-quality exporters. And then the whole thing goes out into the global economy and is sold to the Americans, the Chinese, and everybody else. Southern Europe is the problem. Southern Europe, Italy hasn't grown for 20 years. France has massive debt to GDP constraints and taxation constraints. Not massive, but serious ones. They spend a lot through the state already. The growth rates are low. Historically, the United Kingdom grows faster than the EU average. So what is it that you're joining? Well, if you're 10 years down the line and we go down the path of austerity too, if the Germans have their way and it's all about belt tightening and back to the 60% debt to GDP and all this sort of stuff, well, it means that post-pandemic, Southern Europe's going to have another round of austerity, another round of high unemployment, and another round of political volatility. And this time, it's probably not going to survive in its current form. So you would hope that they know this. I'm not convinced that they do, but we'll see. If, on the other hand, it's all EU next-gen funds, common debt instruments, let's loosen the fiscal constraints, then that's one that Scotland can live with. But if the price of joining is that Scotland has to take what will effectively be an 8% deficit and about 120% debt to GDP in their share of the British national debt, and then basically join the EU and massively contract and have a huge recession for the price, that's going to be a hell of a hard sell, right? That's going to be a very, very tough sell. Do you then approach it from the point of view of Scotland actually doesn't have any national debt? Here's an interesting one. I don't know if you know this one. Not many people know this one. Outside the weird circuits of people who trade bonds. You can't change the counterparty on a bond. So if Scotland becomes independent, it literally has no national debt. Right? You can't inherit it, really. You'd have to voluntarily offer to give a payment in kind to the Bank of England every year to service your share of the debt as some kind of proportion of GDP or income or per capita or something like this, right? And it's
that's been done with many other countries getting independence, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But
you shouldn't be in a situation where Scotland plays hardball and just goes, "No, we're not going to do that. We're just going to walk out. We're going to effectively default on English debt and walk into the EU with no debt." Well, I mean, if you start your life with a voluntary default, don't expect creditors to be nice to you. Right. So,
it's superficially attractive, but
it is. I mean, the thing is, do you want to join the EU depends on which version of the EU you have. Which version of the EU you think will be there in 5 or 10 years? Is it going to be a German Mittelstand export-oriented Sparenkultur, tighten your belts and have no deficits EU? If it is, it's going to be a hell of a hard place for the Scots to exist with it.
Kirsten Patterson from the National, there's an interesting question that broadens out. Who's the US and international community listening to most? Boris Johnson, Nicola Sturgeon, or someone else? It's interesting that I think that Nicola Sturgeon's actually got a place on the world stage that you would not necessarily have expected, more so than, say, the Catalonian leaders or even to some extent than the Kosovo leaders.
I think that's absolutely right. I think she's played a blinder in terms of the kind of the media strategy on this. The 2014 referendum, of course, really put her on the map, taking over from Salmond after the campaign. And, the Scottish government itself, there's many ways it can be criticised, as all governments can be criticised. But as you see from the most recent returns, it's very popular. The Scots like it. They like her. They like what she's doing. And, she came across during the COVID pandemic as somebody who was very much in control listening to the science, knows what's going on, etc. And that, that helps, particularly when basically, if you look across the Atlantic, you had Trump, and then you get Boris, who's sort of like, a posh version of Trump, basically, with slightly less racist edges. And,
racist in Latin, it doesn't count.
It's right, exactly. And she looks good in reflection to that. But the deeper question that Christian is asking, I think, is important, is who's listening to this, right? Nationalists think everyone's listening to this, that this is somehow the most important question in the world, right? And it's not. Most people in the world don't care. Scotland is a tiny place, and it's got hardly any people, and it's part of the UK. And for the rest of the world, we'd probably be happier if it all just went away because it's one less thing to worry about, right? The really interesting thing is who's going to care if it happens, right? If it happens, will be decided internally to Britain. But what matters externally is if it happens, how does it affect everybody else? Start with nukes, go through currency, go down the list.
But you've been in the States now for several decades. Do you see any signs of an American Scots lobby to match the Irish American lobby in its blind and fervent nationalism?
Well, no, because a lot of that was the fact that Scots immigration went originally to the Carolinas in the 17th and 18th century, and then to Canada more than the United States in many ways, although there are many, many Scots Americans. There's a Scottish American Foundation, which does great work networking all the different Scottish American institutions which are around. There are St. Andrew's societies all over the place that are actually like very well heeled and well connected, etc. So, there are people there that are interested and, invested in all senses of the word. So, there are networks to draw upon, put it that way.
But you don't see them having a sort of crucial effect, raising political support and finance.
Well,
you're not going to get a $3 billion a year subsidy for Scotland.
Well, if you think about the archetypal thing of Northeastern Catholic Irish descent American politicians being able to directly influence the Brits over policies over Northern Ireland at the time of the Troubles, right? Scotland's not really in that situation. It's not that kind of literally life or death struggle, and I hope that it never becomes that. And it also isn't ethnicized in the same way that was. So I think that sort of the cadences that made that type of politicization possible just don't exist in Scotland. And I think that's probably a good thing.
Now with Scotland, you mentioned that was very interesting. I think that the Scots nationalists have been very clever in the inclusion of, you've got Scots nationalists wearing turbans. You've got Scots nationalists. That's
great. That guy, the guy with the turban and the flag in 2014, what an image. I mean, it's just...
Yeah, I mean, we're in Scotland, we're Scots, and that's been welcomed. But it's also been suggested by some Scots friends of mine that this is somewhat the icing on the cake, that in fact there is a hardcore of nasty, bigoted nationalism at the bottom of it all, which might, under these circumstances, unintended consequences, rise to the top.
Well, I'll give you two examples. So a couple of weeks ago, there was this stramash, as they'd say in Scotland, where the immigration police, who operate with a mandate to operate in Scotland from London, but are not empowered by the Scottish government, basically drive up to the south side of Glasgow to Pollock Shields and bundle a couple of guys into a van and basically say, your immigration status is revoked, you're out of the country. And the whole street turned out, and then activists showed up. And the next thing, it was 2,000 people, and somebody got under the van to stop it driving and all this sort of stuff. And basically the police had to back down. And that is like one side of what the Scottish political community is like. Now, what it was about a week before Rangers won the league, Glasgow Rangers football.
We should explain to people that Rangers tend to be associated with Northern Ireland Protestantism.
Yeah, David McWilliams, who you might know, has a brilliant phrase for this. He calls the ideology of the Rangers fans and the Scottish Protestant community Erstats Ayrshire, which I just think is fabulous. Like this idea of sort of greater Protestantism being spread, To get back to the story, right? So basically Rangers are the Protestant club, Celtic's the Catholic club. Celtic were about to get 10 championships in a row. It's a very two-horse league. And Rangers stopped them. And despite COVID and everything, all the Rangers fans came out with their Union Jacks, not their Salters, and they went to George Square, the big square in Glasgow, and they had a riot, as football fans are going to do, and they all got drunk and they sung really offensive anti-Catholic songs, etc. Now, guess what? These are two sides of your political community, just like anything, right? You go down to England to watch the England team against the Ukraine at the end of the week, right? You'll find the ugly face of Brexit, and you'll find the really nice side of England as well. The Scots are no different in this regard.
Reassuring.
It's like, you know, if you want to find American communists, you can. If you want to find American bigots, you can. It's a big country.
No, say it ain't so.
And we countries are just the same.
Now, we have one from Aidan Stephen Braze. Do you think Scottish independence is an inevitability? And what would be the worst or case scenarios? You've covered some of this before, but feel free to summarize again.
Well, I mean, to take it in a different direction rather than summarize it, we've got a bit of time left. I mean, I do think it's an inevitability because of the demographics. I think that essentially those young people who really want it now, like 72% of the vote, 75% of the vote, people under 40 want independence. I don't think our number's going to tail off. So simply by virtue of electoral arithmetic, eventually they're going to say, we're done, that's it. It's, you know, as I say, it's a cohort effect rather than a sort of, you know, generational effect. So that's your inevitability in there. Now, so what's the best case for this? The best case for this is the Scottish government's about to do some planning. It's been on hold because of COVID. They want to just make sure that that's all sorted out. There's no talk really of independence or second referendums at the moment. And where they fell down last time was all the hand waving about the economy. Oh, we'll have the pound and we'll do this and we'll do oil and we'll have low taxes and all, just everything. And nobody believed it because it was just this bag of stuff randomly thrown together. And when you've had 300 years of economic integration, you kind of have to do the hard work of stopping and going, all right, what does the Scottish economy actually really look like? If it were independent tomorrow, what would be our globally competitive sector, right? What should we invest in to get us to a better place in terms of our independent economic strength? And how would we create, with that wealth, a more just and fair and open and equitable society? And if you take that project seriously and give it the kind of brain power and effort that it needs to do it to the best you can, and then basically get people on board in the context of doing that, then that's a good scenario, right? That's a good place, because from there, again, I'll quote David McWilliams, right? The great thing about independence is it's yours to screw up. And if you've got a good plan, there's less chance of screwing up, even though nothing ever really goes to plan, to quote Gary Clark, the Scottish songwriter. So that would be a good one. The bad one would be to get militant nationalists on it, to essentially say, all right, we're going to have a referendum because we feel the window's shutting. We're going to just eke over 51, 52%, and we're going to declare independence, and we don't really have a plan. That way, you've got half the country really doesn't want to go there. You'll have massive capital flight out of Scotland as people try and protect their assets. There'll be no time to readjust contracts, expectations, anything like that. Economically, it would be very damaging in and of itself, but most importantly, politically, you just wouldn't bring the people with you. And trying to do independence under those conditions is a really bad idea.
Now, I mean, this is one of the difficulties with referenda and why they're the dictator's choice. You give people a spurious binary yes or no solution, independence or no independence, and then you tie it to the 1%. So, I mean, if you're going to do this, should there be some form of supermajority? Should there be graded questions like, you know, autonomy plus independence with, and grade the questions? And then looking at this week's New York election results, what happened to graded choice questions won't help you. And this is, if you let the Glaswegians loose with a pen on a multiple choice ranking like that.
I'll have it all. I don't want any of that. No, exactly. So yeah, I mean, you point to the real issues with this. I mean, in a sense, it is a binary choice, right? You can't be half pregnant, right? If you want to vote for independence, you're doing it by degree. Is it a wee bit independent, a wee bit more independent, or is it fully independent? Well, that depends on what you think that means. You know, at the end of the day, it's a question of, well, what is it? Do you mean full monetary political sovereignty? Okay, well, how does that work when 60% of your exports still go to the rest of the United Kingdom, right? You're just not sovereign in that sense. So again, I just go back to the same sort of point, which is Scotland needs a compass. It needs to figure out exactly who it is, what it does in the world, what it needs to stop doing in the world, what it needs to do better in the world, and then sell that to the Scottish people and go, look, here's the best, here's what we can say. And my belief on this, and it is a belief because I haven't done that work, and it's a big job, is that you can do it, but it's a generational challenge. Let's take the example of Ireland again. I'll quote McWilliams. McWilliams referred to Ireland's period of independence from the end of the Civil War through to joining the EU as, I think he called it, the Taliban years, where they were basically run by this Catholic theocracy. And the biggest export that Ireland made was labourers going to London. I mean, it was not a good time, and it was not a good.
Eamon de Valera declared economic war on Britain and lost.
Yeah, that was the way to go there, right? Exactly. And so so basically, they had a hard time right the way through to the 1970s, and that's partly ideologically driven, partly because just the capital stock of Ireland was so crap given sort of its colonial legacy of dealing with England, etc. There's lots of reasons for it. The Catholic theology was really right, the theocracy, I should say. Scotland doesn't have any of that stuff. It doesn't need a 50-year drag, but it does need a 20-year period of getting from A to B. And that's going to come with costs if it is to be meaningful. You can have all the independence you want if at the end of the day nothing really changes. You just change the brass plates in Edinburgh. And I think they want more than that. So the question is, well, how do you get from there to there? You need a plan.
At the moment, Jamie McGeechan points out the pandemic. Is it going to dampen or foment independence? Because certainly the Scots government radiates a presumption of competence, which is sadly missing in London. I mean, but at the same time, it's a dreadful thing to be left on your own if you're a small country faced with a global epidemic that shows no signs of withdrawing completely.
And Jamie's exactly right on this. So, would Scotland have had access so quickly to so many doses of the vaccine if it was independence, or would England have prioritised its own population like everybody else does? There are costs with independence as well as benefits, right? So how would you pay for all those vaccines if you have no marketing power, you have no purchasing power, you're not a large enough economy to do a deal that actually is reasonably good with these pharma companies? Again, there are costs as well as benefits. I think in terms of the pandemic, yes, Nicola looks competent in comparison to Boris because Boris looks like he sleeps in a box overnight. So it's not exactly hard to look confident enough.
Somebody opens the lid every morning, I think.
Well, it springs out, right? Jack in the box. But, cynicism and jokes apart, I mean, that's the point of comparison. But what we're seeing now is Britain was doing great 3 months ago, right? It was the vaccine rollout was going fabulous. The NHS was just the cat's whiskers again. And then the Delta variant shows up, in part because of that stupid trade deal with India, so they wouldn't shut the door. But nonetheless, it's there now. And we're not sure how that's going to play out. And that's also going to hurt Scotland. Scotland actually now has the highest rate of infection in the United Kingdom, I believe. So you can look confident, but you're not actually able to control these things. So I'm not sure which way the pandemic over the long run plays out, because we're not out of the pandemic yet by any means.
I mean, the other part, looking at Sturgeon and the Scots Nationalist government, is that they are efficiently administering British central government funds and programs, which the British central government is too incompetent to do south of the border.
Well, I mean, it's not a question of too incompetent to do so. I mean, are they that competent themselves? I'm sure you can find lots of critiques by the Scottish Labour Party, for example, of where the SNP does and does not spend money and what it chooses to focus on. So, I mean, they're competent in the sense that they have an electoral majority behind them that seems to be relatively pleased with where they are. But let's not forget that for all their incompetence, the Tories increased their vote share and increased their majority, particularly in the areas that were most hurt by Tory policies.
Well, that comes on to, I think, what could be almost our segue out of here is the missing factor that we've mentioned in passing, because it is very much en passant, was the mighty Scottish Labour Party that gave the world John Smith, Robin Cook, Gordon Brown, many of the leading Labour politicians, and now they barely make a town council in Scotland.
And in the United Kingdom in general. I mean, there's a political scientist, can't believe I'm blanking on his name now. He's at Essex. Can't remember his name. Anyway, he wrote a piece recently which I think summed it up. It says, what's the Labour Party for? If you've got to a world whereby the Tories, because of the pandemic and simply because in a sense they're a bit bored with the old doing austerity, getting pelters for it and not really being rewarded for it, they've discovered in a world of super low inflation and super low structurally low interest rates that you can spend money and bond prices don't go kitty up and you don't end up with a huge yield spike. You can spend a lot of money. So they've moved to the left economically. They haven't done anything in terms of leveling up, but at least it sounds good. So rhetorically, at least, and economically in some areas, they've moved to the left. In line with your average British voter, they've actually moved to the right culturally in terms of having very cosmopolitan preferences and freedom of immigration and so on and so forth, which the Labour Party's come to embody, trans rights, etc., etc. Your median voter in Britain really isn't too fond of this stuff. So they've become natural conservative voters as the party's just moved to a position to capture all those voters. When you do that, what is the Labour Party for? It's for basically people who are left libertarian individualists, socialists and social democrats who live in cities, tend to be on public employment and have higher education. You cannot win an election with that. That's not a coalition.
Especially when you're being led by neoliberals.
Well, yeah, exactly. But, irony compounds. But nonetheless, I mean, that's where the Labour Party finds itself. So, Matt Goodwin is the guy's name. That's it, Matt Goodwin. Worth reading his stuff on Britain. Basically, I think he's got it right. That basically the Tories, a bit Trump, in a way, Trump didn't form a coalition so much as find one that was just waiting to be recognised. And I think Boris has done the same thing. The traditional social concerns of Northern Labour voters are not the same thing as metropolitan educated people under 30. And he's happy to take them on board. And that's what he's quite successfully done. So Labour Party everywhere is in trouble.
Okay. We're almost coming towards the end. Has anybody got a final question to sum this all up? Anyone to give a rendition of Flowers of Scotland or anything?
As I said, I'm not an emotional nationalist. I'm a pragmatic one.
Okay, well, yeah. Well, one question, which is very difficult sometimes, I work at the UN, and I've tried to explain to various colleagues, whether they're Turks or Russians or Chinese, that if Scotland were to declare independent, there's no conceivable way a British government in Westminster would intervene militarily to stop it happening.
Yeah, I think that's right.
The Chinese don't get this for fairly obvious reasons.
Right. Some people care about territorial integrity more than others. It's an interesting one in the sense that if you think about the Spanish reaction to Catalonian secession, right? So they basically declare, we're going to have a vote because you told us we couldn't. We think the vote is binding. All right, eventually we'll track you down through Interpol warrants and we'll throw you in jail. Right? That's a very, very different reaction to, well, I guess if you do it, and that's it. And I think that what that speaks to is two things. So long as they don't really have to worry about parking the nuclear weapons in the Solent, right, they can probably live with it. But secondly, because of the fact that Scotland is de jure, if not de facto, well, not de facto, not de jure independent, to a large degree through the Scottish government, then in a sense, it's not part of the Westminster imaginary. Again, you talk to English Tories and they talk about the North, they're not talking about Glasgow, right? It's just not, and the Scottish Conservative Party is, functionally dead in many ways. You still pick up 30% of the votes, but you never get any representation, right? That's the nature of the system. So what do you end up with? You end up with a world in which I think the separation's already happened. It just needs to be formalized.
Okay, well, with that, I wouldn't say a pessimistic, a pragmatic.
Yes,
a pragmatically designed conclusion. Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Jamie, get ready to roll. We have, we're not just of this world with Scotland. We're going to go into space soon with our latest press conference, with our latest web. Here, this is the Chinese threat in space, just how important it is, and will it persuade NASA to put lots of money into space exploration, which I'm sure some of the lobbyists are very happy to waive the Chinese threat. I mean, the Chinese had rockets first. We can hardly accuse them of stealing technology, can we?
Fair enough.
We'll find out. So thank you very much. We have a lot of other stuff coming up. Please get in there. Let us know where you are. We'll keep you informed of future press briefings. And if you're a correspondent, join us. And even if you're not a correspondent, you can join us as an associate and be part of this magnificent free-ranging discussion from Xinjiang to Glasgow, and from the south of South Africa to the north of Scotland, where everyone is welcome here. Thank you very much, Mark.
All the best.